Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The town of Esto, Florida barely earns a place on the map. Tucked into the northern edge of the Florida Panhandle, near the Alabama border, it holds fewer than 400 souls, a scattering of modest homes along quiet roads, pine trees standing sentinel over yards baked by relentless summer heat. It is the kind of place where everyone recognizes everyone else's truck, where the loudest sound on an ordinary afternoon is the drone of cicadas. In August of 2007, Esto's quiet was shattered, and it would never fully return to what it once was. In a modest house on one of those quiet roads lived a young woman named Amanda Lewis, 27 years old, a nurse's assistant who worked night shifts at a local nursing home. She was raising 2 children alone, her son AJ, who was 6, and her daughter, Adriana, who was 7. Adriana Elaine Hutto had been born on September 16, 1999, and by the summer of 2007 she was a bright, restless little girl who had been diagnosed with ADHD, a condition that made it hard for her to sit still, to follow rules, to be the quiet, compliant child that some adults expect. Amanda would describe as headstrong, outgoing, a walking shadow who followed her everywhere, so full of energy that she seemed to vibrate with life. AJ, by contrast, was the calm one, content to sit in a corner and play quietly for hours. 2 siblings, 2 temperaments, bound together in a small house under one exhausted mother. To the world, Amanda Lewis was simply a tired single mother doing her best. She loved her life, that things were calm, that the house was full of ordinary noise and ordinary love. But somewhere beneath that surface, something darker had been building, and on the 8th day of August, in temperatures that had climbed past 100 degrees, it would finally break through. That Wednesday began like countless others. Amanda had finished a night shift at the nursing home, and come home to sleep while her children watched cartoons in the living room. The day's only plan was mundane, a trip to buy school supplies before the new academic year began. It should have been a forgettable errand, the kind of task parents everywhere check off their lists without a second thought. But the heat that day was suffocating, thick and heavy even by Panhandle standards, and the children, cooped up inside, began to beg for the pool. In the backyard sat an above-ground pool, for feet deep, ringed by aluminum walls that gleamed dully under the sun. It was not a pool the children were allowed to use without supervision. The ladder that would have let them climb and had been removed and locked away in a shed, to keep 2 young children safe from a hazard that claims more child lives every year than almost any other domestic danger. Amanda told them no, not today, they had errands to run. Instead, she said, she let them go outside to play in the yard for a few minutes while she finished getting ready. What happened in those minutes would become the subject of a criminal trial, a life sentence, and nearly 2 decades later, an active legal battle that continues even now. But on that afternoon, all anyone knew for certain was this. AJ came running back into the house, small and breathless, and told his mother that his sister was in the pool. Amanda's own account, given later to journalists and in court, was that she did not immediately grasp the danger. He said, "Mama, Adriana is in the pool," she recalled. At first I thought he meant maybe she was by the pool, and I said, "Okay, well, tell her to come in." It was only when she looked toward the back door and saw AJ's face, and saw him raking his small hand through the water as though trying to grab hold of something beneath the surface, that she understood something was terribly wrong. She ran. She would later describe sprinting from the house to the pool, her heart hammering, and finding her daughter face down in the water, her skin already taking on a deep, terrible shade of purple. "I knew right then my baby was gone," she said. She pulled Adriana from the pool, began CPR, and called 911. On the recording of that call, a woman's voice, tight with panic, can be heard pleading for an ambulance. "Send an ambulance, please. My daughter fell in the pool, and she's not breathing," she told the dispatcher. "Her lips are purple. What do I do? Water's just coming out of her nose. Please hurry." Paramedics arrived and airlifted Adriana to Bay Medical Center. In the emergency room, a doctor named Linda Fox and her team worked over the small girl's body for more than an hour, fighting to hold on to a pulse that kept slipping away and briefly returning, only to vanish again. At 5:05 in the afternoon, Adriana Hutto was pronounced dead. She was 7 years old. In the immediate aftermath, the tragedy in Esto looked exactly like what every small town dreads and expects: a horrible, ordinary accident. Children left briefly alone. A pool. A sweltering summer day. The local sheriff spoke to reporters and described it in those terms, though he would later be found to have gotten a key detail wrong, telling the press that Adriana had been discovered in the pool by responders when, in truth, her mother had already pulled her out and begun CPR before anyone else arrived. It was a small inaccuracy in a chaotic moment, but it hinted at how quickly a narrative can take shape before all the facts are known. For a short time, that narrative held. Grief settled over the family and the town. Then investigators began speaking with AJ. He was 6 years old, a boy who had just watched his sister die, and who now sat across from adults asking him careful, gentle questions about what he had seen that day. What he told them changed everything. AJ said that his mother had been angry with Adriana, that she had punished her for spraying glass cleaner, and that as punishment, she had held Adriana underwater in the pool. In his own words, spoken with the plain bluntness that only a small child can manage, he told police, "Mama dunked my sister." He described seeing his mother's hand covering Adriana's face as she pushed her beneath the surface. It was on its face, almost too much to believe. A 6-year-old boy, accusing his own mother of drowning his sister. Investigators had to weigh the account of a child against the enormity of the charge. But other details began to align with what AJ had described. An autopsy, later performed by medical examiner Charles Siebert, identified bruising on Adriana's forehead that prosecutors argued matched the pattern of a hand pressing down on a struggling child's face, rather than the kind of injuries typically seen in an accidental drowning. Detectives also noticed something strange during a search of the property. Amanda had told them that she had taken away her children's toys as punishment and stored them in a shed. When investigators searched the shed, they found no toys at all, only a small red wagon and 2 inflatable pool floats sitting out in the yard. The deception, however small it seemed, cast a shadow over everything else Amanda had told them. There was more beneath the surface as well. Investigators learned that Amanda had once admitted she initially struggled to bond with her daughter after Adriana's birth, though she insisted that her love for the girl had deepened over the years. Adriana's ADHD diagnosis surfaced too, a detail prosecutors would use to suggest a motive. A mother, exhausted and overwhelmed by a hyperactive, defiant 7-year-old, who lost control in a moment of rage. One account described an incident in which Adriana had ruined the interior of her mother's car with a marker, and that Amanda had, in a moment of frustration, said aloud that she wanted to kill her daughter, words that witnesses later recalled during the investigation. Amanda denied every allegation. She agreed to take a polygraph test and passed it, insisting throughout that she had not harmed her daughter, that the death was a terrible accident, nothing more. But in September of 2007, just weeks after burying her daughter, Amanda Lewis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors offered her a way out of a sort. A plea deal was placed on the table. If she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, she would serve 10 years in prison, a fraction of what a murder conviction would bring. It was the kind of decision no parent should ever have to face. Weighing an admission of guilt for a crime, she said she did not commit against the terrifying possibility of a life sentence if she gambled on a trial and lost. Amanda refused the deal. She maintained she was innocent, and innocent people, she believed, should not plead guilty to anything. She chose to fight. The trial began in February of 2008 in a Florida courtroom that would soon hold one of the most emotionally wrenching moments the local justice system had seen in years. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of a child. AJ, now 7 years old himself, was brought in to describe, in front of strangers and lawyers and a jury, and in front of the mother he loved, exactly what he had seen happen to his sister. It was the first time he had seen his mother in 6 months. He did not recognize her at first, and when he finally did, he broke down crying. So did she. Amanda later said she begged her own attorney to stop the proceedings, unable to bear watching her son relive the worst day of his life in front of a room full of strangers. But the trial did not stop. AJ's testimony, delivered through tears from a child barely old enough to understand the machinery of the courtroom around him, described his mother dunking Adriana beneath the water. He even provided a crayon drawing depicting what he said he had witnessed, an image that would later be shown to jurors as evidence of a memory too vivid and specific to have been invented. The defense pushed back hard, arguing that a child's memory, especially one so young and so traumatized, could not be trusted as the foundation for a murder conviction. They pointed out that AJ's account had shifted in small ways across multiple interviews with police and investigators, a common feature of child testimony that defense attorneys argued undermined its reliability. But the prosecution countered with the physical evidence. The bruising on Adriana's face, the missing toys, the inconsistencies in Amanda's own statements, and testimony from co-workers who painted an unflattering picture of a woman under strain. The trial itself was not without its own irregularities. On the second day of proceedings, 2 of the 6 jurors originally seated failed to return to the courtroom, forcing the last-minute selection of alternates in the middle of a capital case. It was a detail that seemed minor at the time, buried beneath the weight of the testimony and the grief in the room, but it would resurface nearly 2 decades later in ways no one in that courtroom could have predicted. After 4 days of trial, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in a little over 2 hours, a span that included their lunch break, and delivered their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated abuse. In March of 2008, Amanda Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The girl who had once been her walking shadow was gone, and now the mother who had raised her would spend the rest of her life behind the walls of Homestead Correctional Institution for Women, a facility in the southern part of the state, far from the quiet roads of Esto. AJ did not simply disappear back into an ordinary childhood after the trial ended. The boy who had accused his mother of murder grew up carrying that testimony with him, both as a source of trauma and, in his own telling, as a source of conviction that he had done the right thing. He was eventually raised outside of Amanda's family, his identity protected as he grew older, and it was not until 2025, nearly 18 years after his sister's death, that he chose to speak publicly again, now a young man of 24. In interviews, he stood firmly by everything he had said as a 7-year-old boy. 100% guilty. "I stand by every word I said," he told reporters, repeating the phrase that had once escaped his lips in a police interview room. "Mama dunked my sister." Amanda, for her part, never stopped insisting on her innocence. From within the walls of Homestead Correctional, she continued to maintain that her daughter's death had been a tragic accident, not a murder, and she pointed again and again to the polygraph test she had passed years earlier as proof that she had told the truth from the very beginning. In 2010, her legal team filed an appeal, arguing on technical legal grounds involving what is known as the merger doctrine, essentially contending that a single act of abuse could not simultaneously serve as both the underlying felony and the basis for a felony murder charge. The appeal failed, and her conviction stood, seemingly closing the door on the case for years. But cases like this rarely stay closed forever, not when a woman spends decades in prison insisting she did not do what she was convicted of doing. Reporters uncovered new grounds for appeal buried in the original trial transcripts, the same trial that had unraveled so quickly through jury issues back in 2008. They found that the judge had removed one of the 6 original jurors, even after deeming him fit to serve, and had done so outside Amanda's presence and without her consent, a serious procedural concern in any criminal trial. They discovered that a second juror had never disclosed that she had overheard the lead investigating officer, at a local grocery store no less, declaring that Amanda never should have had children because she was a drug addict, a comment that, if true, revealed a stunning bias entering the jury pool through the back door. And perhaps most strikingly, they found that this same juror had been only 17 years old at the time of the trial, raising basic questions about eligibility that appeared to have gone unnoticed for years. Armed with these findings, Amanda Lewis's legal team filed a motion for post-conviction relief on November 7, 2025, alleging for separate constitutional violations tied to the composition and conduct of the original jury. The motion represents her most serious legal challenge since the original appeal failed a decade and a half earlier, and it has reopened a case that many believed had been settled forever back in that Florida courtroom in 2008. Nearly 2 decades after a 7-year-old girl drowned in a backyard pool in a town most people will never visit, the truth of what happened to Adriana Hutto remains fiercely contested. On one side stands AJ, now a grown man, unwavering in his insistence that he watched his mother hold his sister beneath the water. On the other stands Amanda Lewis, still imprisoned, still maintaining that a devastating accident became, through misunderstanding and flawed evidence, a life sentence for a crime she says she never committed. Somewhere between those two accounts lies a little girl who never got the chance to grow up, whose voice was never heard in any courtroom, and whose short, energetic life ended in the shallow water of an above-ground pool on an unbearably hot afternoon in August. A family was destroyed that day, in ways that rippled far beyond the original tragedy. A brother carried the burden of testifying against his own mother before he had even lost his baby teeth. A mother has spent most of her adult life behind bars, clinging to a claim of innocence that a new legal motion may finally test again. And a small town in the Florida Panhandle, once known for nothing at all, will forever be remembered for the pool in its backyard where Adriana Hutto took her last breath, and for the question that still has no universally agreed answer. Was it a terrible accident, or was it murder? Story 2. There may danger that wears a friendly face. It dresses well, speaks smoothly, knows how to make a room feel warm, and understands, with almost surgical precision, how to make a person feel chosen. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning signs hanging around its neck. It arrives looking like an opportunity, like a dream, like the kind of man who has everything figured out. This is the story of Caleb Mickens, a man who built an entire life out of illusion, and of Sheila Cuevas, a brilliant woman who deserved so much more than the fate she met inside an apartment in Fort Worth, Texas, in the autumn of 2023. Caleb Mickens was 34 years old at the time of Sheila's death. He was known across social media platforms not by his real name, but by a nickname that told you everything about the identity he had invented for himself, Cash Cartier. The name evoked luxury. It evoked success. It was the name of a man who had cracked the code, who had figured out how money worked, who had mastered a system that ordinary people were still struggling to understand. And for a time, the money was real, at least in the sense that it was flowing. Mickens had built his income and his public profile through an organization called I Am Academy, a multi-level marketing operation that prosecutors described as targeting younger people with the promise of earning thousands of dollars weekly, operating under the pretense of being an educational platform. At the peak of his involvement with I Am Academy, Caleb Mickens was reportedly bringing in approximately $20,000 a week. $20,000 every week. It is the kind of number that sounds almost impossible, the kind of number that, when a confident, well-dressed man says it to a room full of people who are barely getting by, makes everyone lean forward in their seats. That was the point. The Federal Trade Commission would eventually catch up with I Am Academy. In September 2025, two individuals connected to the scheme were ordered to pay $10.5 million over allegations of falsely claiming income to recruit new members. But that reckoning came later. In 2023 in Fort Worth, the money was already running out for Caleb Mickens, and the income that had funded his image, his lifestyle, and the persona of Cash Cartier was shrinking. The man behind the curtain was beginning to show. Sheila Cuevas was not someone easily deceived. That is perhaps the hardest part of this story to sit with. By the accounts of those who knew her, Sheila was exceptional. She had been a valedictorian, a title reserved for the very best in a graduating class, the student who worked harder and climbed higher than everyone around her. She had gone on to earn a graduate degree, a testament to discipline, intellect, and ambition that most people never achieve. She had a loving family. She had a future full of real promise. But Sheila Cuevas ended up in Caleb Mickens' grips and could not find a way out, even with a loving family around her. That phrase, ended up in his grips, contains worlds within it. It speaks to a process, slow and deliberate, by which a person who is skilled at manipulation can make even the most intelligent, most capable human being feel that they have no exit. Mickens described as a master of manipulation, someone who was just incredibly abusive and who was, at his core, just an abuser. These were not words chosen carelessly. They were the conclusions of over a dozen women who had encountered Caleb Mickens and had survived to tell what had been done to them. More than a dozen women. That number, when it emerged during the investigation, reshaped the entire narrative of this case. Sheila Cuevas was not the first person to experience Caleb Mickens' violence. She was not the beginning of a pattern. She was its endpoint, or more accurately, she was the point at which a pattern that had been building across years and across multiple relationships finally reached its most devastating consequence. The day that everything became visible to the outside world was October 8th, 2023. It was an autumn Sunday in Fort Worth. What happened inside the apartment Caleb Mickens shared with Sheila Cuevas on that day has never been fully reconstructed, because the only person present who survived to describe it is the man who caused it. And his account, as investigators would conclusively determine, was a lie. What is known as this: Caleb Mickens called 911 that afternoon. When the dispatcher picked up, he reported that his girlfriend was not breathing. The reason he gave, the story he chose, in what must have been a rapid and calculating moment of crisis management, was that his dog had attacked her. The dog's name was Soldier, and Soldier, Mickens told authorities, had turned on Sheila and was responsible for what had happened. Emergency responders arrived at the apartment. What they found was Sheila Cuevas at the foot of her bed. She was unresponsive. When medical personnel and investigators examined her, they found the terrible architecture of what had been done to her. Several broken ribs and puncture wounds consistent with what one might expect from an animal attack. Or, investigators would later determine, from something far more deliberate. In the immediate aftermath, the story of the dog seemed, at least superficially, to be a story. Soldier was taken by animal control and euthanized, a grim and irreversible act that, as investigators later concluded, destroyed an innocent animal for a crime the dog had nothing to do with. The euthanasia of Soldier may have seemed, to Caleb Mickens, like the closing of a door. If the dog was gone, the central prop of his alibi was beyond the reach of further examination. What he may not have fully anticipated was the thoroughness of the investigation that was already beginning. Investigators from the Arlington Police Department began working the case alongside Tarrant County prosecutors. Detective Tracy Dixon, whose name the DA's office would specifically acknowledge when the case reached its conclusion, was among the investigators who pulled at the threads of Mickens' account until it came undone. The forensic and medical examination of Sheila Cuevas' injuries told a story that contradicted the one Mickens had offered to the 911 dispatcher. According to prosecutors, investigators determined that Mickens had not just allowed harm to come to Sheila. He had drugged her. He had beaten her. The injuries that ended her life came from violence inflicted by a human being, not an animal. Animal Control's own examination confirmed that Soldier had nothing to do with Cuevas' injuries or her death. But here is where the case encountered one of its most painful complications, one that would define the limits of what justice could accomplish in a courtroom, even when the truth had been established to the satisfaction of investigators. The medical examiner's findings, while consistent with violent assault, created complications for prosecutors in proving the specific cause of death to the legal standard required for a murder charge. The human body is a complex instrument, and cause of death is a precise legal and medical determination. As Fort Worth attorney Peter Gieseking acknowledged publicly, there were some complications with the case with the medical examiner proving the cause of death, so we weren't able to charge him with murder. He added, in words that carry a quiet, unresolved weight, "But ultimately, what happened on that day we don't really know." What followed was the painstaking work of building the strongest available case within the constraints of what could be proved. Prosecutors expanded their investigation outward from the apartment in Fort Worth, and what they found was staggering in its breadth. The women who had encountered Caleb Mickens over the years had, many of them, kept their experiences largely private. The silence that often accompanies abuse from someone charming, someone connected, someone who has cultivated the image of a successful and admired man. But the investigation opened a door, and one by one, more than a dozen women walked through it. The picture that emerged from those conversations was of a man who had engaged in a pattern of abuse, manipulation, torture, and sexual assault across multiple relationships over an extended period of time. Prosecutors in Dallas County had already logged charges against Mickens from prior relationships, an aggravated assault causing serious bodily injury, and an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He had been on probation. He had continued. The case against Caleb Mickens was filed. He was arrested and charged with aggravated assault in connection with Sheila Cuevas' death. As the months passed and the legal process moved forward, the broader scope of who he was became clearer in the public record. The man who had performed wealth and success and the vocabulary of self-improvement and financial freedom under the brand of Cash Cartier was something else entirely in the private spaces where no one was watching. April 7, 2026, more than 2 years after Sheila Cuevas died at the foot of her bed in Fort Worth, became the day the courtroom held its reckoning. Caleb Mickens appeared before the Tarrant County Court and entered a guilty plea to first-degree aggravated assault, family violence, in acknowledgement of his role in the fatal assault and drugging of Sheila Cuevas. The plea was part of an arrangement that secured a definitive sentence while avoiding the uncertainty of a murder trial constrained by the complexities of the medical examiner's findings. The sentencing hearing that followed was not a quiet proceeding. The courtroom was packed. The families of women who had survived their encounters with Caleb Mickens were there. The family of Sheila Cuevas was there, and one by one they spoke. Victim impact statements are among the most powerful moments in any criminal proceeding. They are the moments when law steps back and allows grief and truth to speak in plain language, without the filter of legal argument. The women who stood before the court on that day described years of fear, of manipulation, of violence done to them by the same man who now sat with his future in the hands of a judge. Sheila's family, including her brother, looked directly at Caleb Mickens. Their words, reported in the press, carried the precise and devastating clarity of people who have spent more than 2 years living inside an unspeakable loss and have arrived, finally, at the moment they were promised. "There can be no justice that brings Sheila back," they told him. "But there can be outcomes, and there can be accountability, and you deserve this." The judge delivered the sentence. For the first-degree aggravated assault in the death of Sheila Cuevas, 40 years in prison. Combined with the 20-year probation revocation from Dallas County and the 15-year sentence for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon from a separate Dallas County case, the total weight of the court's judgment fell on Caleb Mickens with the full force of everything that had been uncovered. He will spend decades inside a prison. The man who called himself Cash Cartier, who built a persona out of the language of luxury and success, who targeted young people with the promise of financial transformation, while privately leaving a trail of broken lives behind him. That man will grow old behind bars. The Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, in closing the chapter on this case, took care to extend specific acknowledgement to Detective Tracy Dixon and the Arlington Police Department, and to the many women who had come forward from across the country to provide testimony and evidence. It is worth pausing on that phrase, from across the country. It is a reminder of the geography of Micken's behavior, of how widely his pattern of harm had spread, and of how many individual acts of courage it took for the truth to finally be assembled into something the legal system could act on. Elena Bangs, the prosecutor who had worked this case and spoken most openly about its meaning, returned again and again in her public comments to one particular detail about Sheila Cuevas. Not the manner of her death, not the legal complications that had constrained the charges, but the fact of who Sheila was. A valedictorian, a graduate degree holder, someone with a loving family. Bangs did not say this to suggest that some victims deserve more attention than others. She said it to make visible the thing that Caleb Micken's public image had so effectively obscured, that he had made himself credible and appealing to people who were smart enough to know better, precisely because he was skilled at making lies feel like opportunity. The case of Caleb Mickens is, at its heart, a case about the distance between what a person shows the world and what they actually are. It is about the spaces inside a relationship where no camera or social media post can reach. It is about the courage it takes for a survivor to step forward when the person who hurt them is powerful and charming and has spent years convincing everyone, including perhaps their victim, that they are something other than what they are. And it is, most painfully, about a young woman of remarkable intelligence and capability named Sheila Cuevas, who deserved decades of life still ahead of her, and who was denied them on an autumn afternoon in Fort Worth by someone she trusted. The dog named Soldier is gone, euthanized for a crime that was never his. The income from IM Academy has long since collapsed. The persona of Cash Cartier exists now only in old posts and the memories of people who were recruited into its orbit. What remains is the record, the plea, the sentences, the courtroom full of women who found the strength to speak, and the family of Sheila Cuevas, standing in a Tarrant County courthouse and telling a man who had taken everything from them that there are outcomes, and there is accountability, and that he deserved exactly what arrived. Story 3. Crothersville, Indiana is the kind of town where nothing much happens, and that has always been the point of living there. A single traffic light blinks over its main intersection. Fewer than 2,000 people call it home, and most of them know each other by name, by porch, by the sound of a particular truck engine passing on the road. It sits about 40 miles north of Louisville, Kentucky, close enough to feel the pull of a bigger city, but far enough to remain something quieter, slower, and for 25 years before January of 2005, entirely free of murder. That last fact would not survive the winter. On the afternoon of January 25th, 2005, 10-year-old Caitlin Katie Coleman came home from Crothersville Elementary School, just as she did every day, arriving around 3 o'clock with the kind of energy only a fourth grader anticipating a pajama party the next day can carry. Her father, John, had driven her to school that morning before heading to work, and by the time Katie walked through her own front door, her mother, Angie, was already in the kitchen preparing dinner. It was an ordinary domestic scene, repeated in one form or another in countless homes across America that same afternoon, and nothing about it suggested it would be remembered, examined, and mourned for decades to come. The Coleman household, like many, occasionally ran short on small necessities, and this particular evening it was toilet paper. Katie, wanting to help, volunteered to walk to the nearby Dollar General store and pick some up. Angie handed her $1.10 and thought nothing of it. The store sat only a block and a half away, a walk Katie had made many times before without incident. There was no reason, on a street this familiar, in a town this small, to expect anything but her daughter's return within a few short minutes. Those minutes passed, and then more minutes, and then an hour, and Katie did not come home. At first Angie was not alarmed. Katie was well-liked, with friends scattered along the route between the Dollar General and their house, and it seemed entirely plausible that she had stopped somewhere to talk, to play, to lose track of time the way children do. Angie began making calls, working through the short list of neighbors and school friends who might know where her daughter had wandered off to. One by one, the calls came back empty. Nobody had seen her. As the light outside faded into the flat gray of an Indiana winter evening, the plausible explanations thinned out, and worry took their place. Angie searched the streets herself before finally calling the police at around 7:30 that evening to report her daughter missing. Word spreads fast in a place the size of Crothersville, and grief, or the fear of it, spreads faster. By the time police officers arrived at the Coleman home, roughly 125 local residents had already gathered to help search, a spontaneous mobilization of neighbors, relatives, and strangers united by the simple, unbearable fact that a child was missing. They searched through the night and into the next day. A helicopter circled overhead. Search dogs picked up Katie's scent and followed it toward a nearby set of railroad tracks before the trail went cold. In a small, aching detail that would only make sense later, a neighbor recalled that on the very day she vanished, Katie had stopped by their house specifically to tell them that their dog had been struck and killed near those same railroad tracks. An errand of kindness, layered atop an errand of duty, both cut short by whatever happened to her afterward. Because there was no immediate evidence of an abduction, no witness, no struggle, no obvious sign of foul play. Authorities did not issue an Amber Alert right away. Missing person posters went up instead, describing a girl 4 feet 6 inches tall, with chin-length brown hair, brown eyes, and a lazy eye, last seen in a red shirt, black sweatpants with a stripe down the leg, black tennis shoes, and a light blue winter coat. For a family already living inside a nightmare, the wait for official escalation must have felt like its own private torment, watching bureaucratic caution move at a pace entirely out of step with a mother's fear. Days passed. Then, on January 29th, for days after Katie disappeared, a critical piece of information surfaced. A witness came forward, certain they had seen Katie riding in the passenger seat of a white Ford F-150 pickup truck, roughly 15 years old but clean and well cared for, shortly after she vanished. Based on this account, police released a composite sketch of a young man believed to have taken her. Thin, white, somewhere between 18 and 20 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. Finally, days after her disappearance, an Amber Alert was issued, making Katie's case the first in Indiana's history in which the child being sought under that system would ultimately be found dead. Her parents, in the raw language of people clinging to any possibility of a peaceful resolution, released a written plea to whoever was holding their daughter. "Please do not harm her," they wrote. "Just drop her off anywhere, so she may return to a family and a community that loves her very much and misses her dearly." It is a plea that carries its own quiet devastation in hindsight, a mother and father reaching out into the dark with the only tool they had left, the hope that whoever had their daughter still possessed some shred of mercy. On the 5th day of the search, that hope ended. An Indiana State Police trooper discovered a body in a stream in the Cypress Lake area, roughly 15 to 19 miles from the Coleman home. It was Katie. Her hands had been bound tightly behind her back, and she had been assaulted before being drowned. For a town that had gone 25 years without a single murder, this was not simply the loss of one child. It was the shattering of an assumption Crothersville had carried about itself, the quiet belief that whatever darkness existed in the wider world, it did not reach places like this. In the raw, urgent days following the discovery of Katie's body, investigators moved quickly. Suspicion fell on a local man named Charles Hickman, who lived just yards from the Dollar General store where Katie had been headed. Neighbors had long considered Hickman something of an oddity, a man who would stand in his yard staring at nothing in particular, who hosted parties late into the night. When questioned, Hickman offered investigators a confession, though it was a confession built on a strange and specific claim. He said Katie had stumbled upon people manufacturing drugs at a nearby apartment complex called Penn Villa, and that he had abducted her, not to harm her, he insisted, but simply to frighten her into staying silent about what she had seen. According to his account, he took her to the creek in the middle of the night, intending only to scare her, and in the confusion she either fell or was pushed into the water and drowned by accident. He said he fled the scene afterward. For a brief period, it appeared to investigators and the public alike that the case had been solved. Hickman was arrested and charged with murder and criminal confinement. A second man, Timothy O'Sullivan, was arrested shortly afterward on charges of lying to police during the investigation. The story that emerged, a small-town methamphetamine operation, an innocent child who wandered too close, a panic cover-up, fit a narrative that was, in its own tragic way, comprehensible. It offered Crothersville something to hold on to, an explanation, however grim, that made sense of the incomprehensible. But comprehension and truth are not always the same thing, and investigators soon noticed that Hickman's account kept shifting. Details changed from one interview to the next in ways that raised troubling questions rather than resolving them. Rather than accept a confession that no longer held together, detectives pushed further, returning to the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene itself. DNA found on Katie's body and on a cigarette, but discarded near the creek where she had been found. When that DNA was processed and compared against available records, it did not match Charles Hickman at all. It matched a different man entirely, Anthony Ray Stockelman, a local father of 3. Stockelman's connection to the case deepened quickly once investigators began looking closely. Beyond the DNA recovered from Katie's body and from the cigarette, but at the crime scene, forensic analysts also matched red carpet fibers found on her body to carpet inside the home of Stockelman's mother. A local witness independently recalled seeing Katie riding in a Ford truck matching the description and ownership of a vehicle connected to Stockelman. Piece by piece, the case against Hickman, built on an unstable confession that had never fully aligned with the physical evidence, gave way entirely to a case against a different man altogether. In a striking reversal, murder charges against Hickman were dropped in May of 2005, even though he had confessed to the crime. Prosecutors themselves admitted they could not fully explain why he had done so. Hickman's attorney later stated that his client denied any involvement in Katie's abduction and death once the new evidence came to light. Stockelman, already in custody on charges of molesting Katie around the time of her death, was now charged with murder and criminal confinement as well. Investigators had traced their way to him through that discarded cigarette, but near the creek, a small, careless piece of evidence left behind in what he likely believed was an isolated, unwitnessed act. The state, armed with DNA linking him directly to the crime, initially sought the death penalty, citing the age of the victim as an aggravating circumstance severe enough to warrant it. Rather than proceed to a full trial, Stockelman and prosecutors reached a plea agreement roughly a year after his arrest. He agreed to plead guilty to murder and child molesting, and to waive his right to have a jury weigh the aggravating circumstances of his case. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to remove the death penalty from consideration and to dismiss the criminal confinement charge, leaving the matter of sentencing entirely in the hands of a judge. As he was led out of the courtroom following this agreement, his own wife, Tabitha, cried out to him, asking simply, "Why'd you do it, Tony?" It is a question that captures, perhaps better than any legal document could, the personal devastation rippling outward from Katie's death. A wife forced to confront the possibility that the man she had built a life with was capable of something monstrous, asked aloud in a courtroom, in front of everyone, with no good answer forthcoming. At his sentencing hearing, Stockelman's defense presented several mitigating arguments in an effort to avoid the harshest possible sentence. They noted that his only 2 prior convictions were misdemeanors, one 2 decades old, for purchasing beer for his younger brother, and another for battery, arguing this reflected a relatively crime-free life. They argued that his father's death 6 months before the murder, following a long battle with cancer, had left him under extreme emotional disturbance, noting he had been especially close to his father and had helped care for him while dying. They pointed to his guilty plea itself as a mitigating factor, and to the hardship his imprisonment would impose on his 2 young sons, ages 6 and 13. who were described as having enjoyed a close relationship with their father. The court found these arguments unpersuasive against the severity of what he had done. Testimony at the hearing revealed that Stockelman had, in fact, sunk progressively deeper into drug use and had abused his former wife on multiple occasions, undercutting the picture of a crime-free life his defense had tried to paint. There was no clinical evidence to support the claim of extreme emotional disturbance, and one family friend testified that while Stockelman had been upset about his father's death, his reaction had been nothing out of the ordinary. Weighing everything before it, the trial court sentenced Anthony Ray Stockelman to life imprisonment without parole for Katie's murder, followed by an additional 30 years for child molesting. He later appealed, arguing the sentence failed to properly account for these mitigating factors, but the Indiana Supreme Court affirmed the sentence in full in 2007, finding the aggravating weight of killing a 10-year-old child far outweighed anything offered in his defense. Reaction in Crothersville was, understandably, divided. Many residents expressed relief that the grim details of Katie's final hours would not need to be relitigated in a public trial, sparing her family that particular ordeal. Others felt that nothing short of death was an adequate answer to what had been done to a child. One local resident, Marcia Fink, spoke for many when she said she would have preferred to see Stockelman face the death penalty, but took some comfort in knowing he would be punished regardless. Stockelman was transferred to the Wabash Valley Correctional Facility to begin serving his sentence, and in what can only be described as an extraordinary and unplanned collision of fate, one of Katie's own cousins, a man named Jared Harris, happened to be incarcerated in the same facility on unrelated burglary charges. Harris learned of Stockelman's presence and on September 22, 2006, orchestrated a confrontation that would become, in its own dark way, as widely discussed as the crime itself. Harris slipped into Stockelman's cell ahead of time and waited. When Stockelman entered, Harris locked the door behind him, trapping the two men together, and held Stockelman down. What followed was neither quick nor accidental. Using a makeshift tattoo device, Harris inked the words, "Katie's Revenge," across Stockelman's forehead in bold, unmistakable letters, ensuring that anyone who looked at him from that day forward would see, permanently displayed on his own skin, an accusation he could never hide from or explain away. The act spread quickly through news coverage nationally and internationally, less as an endorsement of prison violence than as a strange, uncomfortable symbol of a community's need to see some visible reckoning for a crime that had otherwise been resolved quietly, through paperwork and plea agreements rather than a public trial. Years later, efforts were reportedly made to remove the tattoo through laser treatment, though accounts suggest that while the ink faded, a visible scar in the shape of the words remained. Katie Coleman's murder left marks on Crothersville that extended well beyond the Stockelman case's legal resolution. Her death, and the initial belief that it stemmed from a drugs operation in the area, briefly cast a spotlight on the broader drug problems facing small rural communities like hers, even though investigators ultimately determined that the meth-related explanation offered by Hickman had itself been false information. The town's collective sense of safety, built over 25 years without a single homicide, could not simply be restored by a conviction. It had to be rebuilt slowly, by a community that had watched over 100 neighbors mobilize within hours to search for one of their own, only to lose her regardless. For John and Angie Coleman, no sentence, however severe, could return what had been taken on that January afternoon. A daughter who had only wanted to help her mother, walking a familiar block and a half to buy something as ordinary as toilet paper, never imagining it would be the last errand of her life. Katie Coleman's story endures not because of the strange twist in a prison cell years later, but because of the simple, devastating truth beneath it. A 10-year-old girl trusted the world around her, as children are meant to, and that trust was met with unimaginable harm. What remains, decades on, is a small Indiana town that still remembers her name, and a family that has spent every year since carrying a loss no verdict could ever fully settle. Story 4. Green Bay, Wisconsin is a city best known, to most of the country, for a football team and the cold that rolls in off Lake Michigan each winter, turning ordinary streets into stretches of gray ice and hard, packed snow. It is also, like countless mid-sized American cities, a place where families live quietly in modest homes, where sons work alongside their fathers in family businesses, and where the rhythms of daily life rarely make the evening news. 24-year-old Shad Therian belonged to that quieter Green Bay. He worked with his father and grandfather in the family trade, and those who knew him described a man who was kind, who thought of others before himself, who enjoyed camping and games and the particular patient satisfaction of carving wood into shapes with his own hands. Nothing about the life Shad Therian lived suggested the horror that would end it in February of 2022, and nothing about the woman he had known since middle school, a woman named Taylor Shabiznes, gave any easy warning of what she was capable of doing to him. This is a difficult story to tell, not because the facts are unclear, but because they are almost unbearable. It is the story of two people whose history together stretched back to childhood, of a relationship tangled up with addiction, and of a single night that ended in a killing so extreme that even seasoned investigators, officers who had spent careers walking into crime scenes most people are spared from ever seeing, found themselves shaken by what they discovered in a quiet house on the west side of the city. It is also, in its own way, a story about a mother, and about the unimaginable moment she went looking for her son in her own basement. Shad Therian and Taylor Shabiznes had known each other since their school years, a friendship that had, over time, grown into something more complicated, an on and off relationship that continued alongside both of their struggles with drugs. Taylor, 25 years old at the time, was no stranger to the criminal justice system. Earlier that same year, in January of 2022, she had been convicted of fleeing, eluding, and obstructing a police officer, and sentenced to 3 months in jail for it. It remains unclear whether, by February, she was serving that sentence through some form of work release or supervised arrangement, but what is known is that she was wearing a GPS ankle monitor at the time, a monitor she would later remove entirely, slipping out from under the one mechanism meant to track her whereabouts in the hours after the crime that would define the rest of her life. On the evening of February 21st, 2022, Taylor picked Shad up from his mother's home at around 9:30 p.m. It was an ordinary beginning to what should have been an ordinary night between two people who had spent years drifting in and out of each other's lives. A mutual friend joined them, and the three drove to an apartment on Eastman Avenue, where they smoked together. At some point the friend left, and it was then that the evening turned towards something far more dangerous. She and Shad smoked and injected trazodone, a prescription medication typically used to treat depression and insomnia, at the apartment. Whatever judgment either of them still carried by that point was almost certainly clouded by the combination of substances now moving through their bodies. From the apartment, the two returned to the home Shad shared, at least in part, with his mother, Tara Pekanik, and her boyfriend, Steve Hendricks. That night, the house was empty of anyone but the two of them. Tara and Steve were away, leaving Shad and Taylor alone in the basement of a home that had, until that point, been nothing more than a family's ordinary living space. She and Shad had, on previous occasions, engaged in a dangerous form of role play involving restricted breathing, and that this night they used metal chains as part of that activity. It is a detail that matters not because it excuses anything that followed, but because it frames the tragedy at its center. Two people engaged in something consensual and reckless, until one of them made a choice that turned recklessness into an irreversible act of violence. Taylor began to strangle Shad. He started to cough up blood. His skin began to change color. And rather than stop, rather than do the one thing that might have saved his life in that moment, she continued, feeling a kind of enjoyment in what she was doing, telling investigators plainly that she liked it. The strangulation took somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes to end Shad Therian's life. It is a span of time almost impossible to hold in the mind fully, long enough for a person's body to fight desperately for air, long enough for a partner to have stopped, and short enough, in the end, to erase a 24-year-old man's entire future. In the hours after his death, Taylor did not seek help, did not call for anyone, and did not attempt to conceal what had happened out of panic or remorse. Instead, she remained with his body for an extended period, and by the following morning, she had located kitchen knives in the house and begun to dismember his remains. She positioned his body to carry this out, collecting blood in a bucket and a storage container, before ultimately pouring what she had collected down a basement shower drain. Organs were removed from the body and placed inside plastic bags, cardboard boxes, and additional containers scattered through the basement. Tara Pekanik returned to her home in the early morning hours of February 23rd, roughly 2 days after her son had last been seen alive. She was woken sometime around 2:30 a.m. by the sound of her front door closing. It is easy, in hindsight, to imagine the ordinary assumptions a mother might make in that half-asleep moment, that her son was home, moving quietly so as not to wake her, perhaps heading down to the basement he sometimes used as his own space. She went downstairs to check whether he was there. He was not. She went back upstairs, and it was only then, in circumstances no parent should ever have to describe, that she came upon a green plastic bucket sitting at the bottom of the basement stairs, a shower towel draped over its top. What Tara Pekanik found beneath that towel was her son's severed head. There are no adequate words for what that moment must have contained. The instant collapse of every ordinary assumption about the night, the transformation of a familiar basement into a scene no mind is prepared to process. Her boyfriend, Steve Hendricks, called 911 immediately. When Green Bay police officers arrived, their body camera footage captured them searching the basement methodically before confirming, with the grim clinical language required in such moments, that a human head was indeed inside the bucket. Officer Alex Wanish would later testify to lifting the towel himself and finding, unmistakably, what lay beneath. The rest of Shad's remains were discovered spread through the house, inside plastic bags, cardboard boxes, and a storage tote. Police located Taylor Schabusiness later that same day at an apartment complex on Eastman Avenue, the same street where the evening had begun 2 nights earlier. Her clothing was stained with blood. She had a cut on her left thumb and scratches along her arms, which she told officers had been self-inflicted. The GPS monitor she had been wearing under the terms of her earlier sentence was gone, removed at some point in the intervening hours. She was arrested and on March 1st, formally charged with murder, mutilation of a corpse, and third-degree assault. What emerged in the months that followed was not a case built on circumstantial evidence or careful forensic reconstruction alone, but one built substantially on Taylor's own words. In interviews with detectives, she reportedly described, without apparent remorse, continuing to engage with Shad's body for a period of hours after his death, before ultimately proceeding with the dismemberment the following morning. She told investigators she had planned to keep all of his body parts, though she said she eventually grew tired of the process. A chilling admission that framed an act of extraordinary violence in almost mundane, exhausted terms. At another point, according to the criminal complaint, she indicated to detectives that they would have an entertaining time locating all of the organs she had distributed through the house. When asked why she continued strangling Shad even after he began coughing blood, she reportedly told detectives she wanted to see what would happen. And in one of the most disturbing statements attributed to her during the investigation, she asked detectives whether they understood what it felt like to love something so deeply that you would kill it. Taylor's defense attorney at the time, Quinn Jolly, filed a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect in September of 2022, signaling that her legal team intended to argue she was not criminally responsible for her actions due to insanity. But the road to trial itself became marked by further disturbing incidents. In February 2023, during a hearing in which Jolly requested the trial be delayed so experts could evaluate her competency, Taylor attacked her own attorney in open court, an assault serious enough that a Brown County Sheriff's deputy was required to physically restrain her. No one was seriously injured, but the episode led Jolly to withdraw from the case entirely. He was replaced by attorney Christopher Froelich. A court-appointed physician ultimately found her competent to stand trial, and Judge Thomas Walsh, who had personally witnessed the courtroom attack, declined a request that he recuse himself from the case. As the trial approached, forensic psychologist Diane Litton testified that Taylor had told her, during evaluation, that she had felt some kind of personal fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer, another notorious Wisconsin killer, describing what she called having had a thing with him roughly a year before Shad's death. A claim made stranger by the fact that Dahmer had been killed by a fellow inmate in prison decades earlier, in 1994, making any such connection impossible. Prosecutors also sought to introduce evidence that Taylor had conducted internet searches referencing Dahmer in the time surrounding the murder, material the defense fought unsuccessfully to have excluded from trial. Taylor Schabusiness's trial began in July 2023, and over the course of 3 days, jurors were asked to absorb testimony far beyond what most criminal trials require of ordinary citizens. They heard from Detective Graff about her admissions during interrogation. They heard from Dr. Trankita about the extent of the dismemberment, described in the exacting clinical detail that autopsy testimony demands. They heard from Officer Wanish about the moment the bucket's contents were confirmed. Throughout much of the proceeding, according to courtroom observers, Taylor appeared to smirk as some of the most disturbing evidence was presented, a demeanor that stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the gravity of what was being described. The jury did not need long to reach its conclusion. After deliberating for roughly 30 minutes, they returned a unanimous verdict on July 26, 2023, finding Taylor Schabusiness guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilation of a corpse, and third-degree physical assault. Because her defense had entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, the trial proceeded into a second phase, sometimes called the responsibility phase, in which the same jury was asked to determine whether Taylor had, in fact, suffered from a qualifying mental illness at the time of the killing that would have excused her from criminal responsibility. The jury rejected that claim as well, finding unanimously that she had not been suffering from any such condition when she killed Shad Therian. On September 26, 2023, Judge Thomas Walsh handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his remarks from the bench, Walsh spoke plainly about the necessity of protecting the public from a person capable of such violence, describing the crime as an offense against human decency, human dignity, and the broader human community. It was by any measure among the most severe judgments Wisconsin law allows. Perhaps the most striking moment of the entire case came not from the prosecution, the judge, or the defendant, but from Shad's own father, who addressed Taylor directly during the sentencing proceedings. Rather than words of anger, he offered something far more difficult to give: forgiveness. He told her that everybody makes bad choices, though rarely on such a devastating scale, and that hatred would serve no purpose. He said he believed she still had a heart, still had a mind, and that nothing would be gained by carrying hatred toward her for the rest of his life. It stands as one of the more remarkable acts of grace recorded in the aftermath of any violent crime, a father choosing compassion in the face of a loss that few parents could imagine surviving with any composure at all. Taylor Schabusiness remains incarcerated at Techita Correctional Institution, a facility for female inmates in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, serving out her life sentence. Her time behind bars has not been without further incident. In December 2025, she was sentenced to an additional 90 days after attacking staff members at the facility, and she has, on more than one occasion since her conviction, clashed violently with legal representatives assigned to her case. In early 2025, she formally dropped her appeal, closing the door on any further legal challenge to the conviction that had already been affirmed by the jury's swift and unanimous judgment. For Green Bay, and for the family that continues to carry Shad Therian's memory, what remains is not the horror of the case's most extreme details, but the portrait of the man himself, a son who worked beside his father, who found quiet satisfaction in carving wood with his hands, who camped and played games and, according to those who knew him best, thought of others before himself. It is that ordinary, gentle life, cut short in circumstances no family should ever have to comprehend, that ultimately defines the loss at the center of this case, far more than the extraordinary violence that ended it. Story 5. On the humid Tennessee morning of June 27, 2023, the city of Kingsport woke with the first light filtering through the leaves of the greenbelt, bright but muffled as if the heat itself was already pressing down on hope. In a field next to the Amarcourt Hotel, a slender young woman was seen, barefoot, her blonde hair tangled, her brown eyes restless and darting, in a state of profound, visible distress. Her name was Layla Santinello, and to those who loved her, she was irreplaceable. To the rest of Kingsport, she quickly became the city's unresolved question, the ghostly presence in every shaded corridor and wooded hollow, whose fate has haunted the city ever since. Layla was born in Neptune Township, New Jersey, on August 5, 2002, to Jennifer and George. The early chapters of her life were ordinary, marked by laughter and small dramas, the type that fill childhood homes and later, the rooms occupied by young adults trying to survive on hope. In the end, Layla carried the legacy of that childhood into motherhood when she gave birth to her daughter, Nova Grace. By 2023, Layla was just 22. She was tiny, just 4 feet 10 inches, but never invisible. She had tattoos, including the name Nova Grace on her shoulder, which served both as a mark of pride and a silent prayer for the daughter she adored. Kingsport became her home, but by late spring of 2023, home was a difficult concept. Layla was struggling deeply with fentanyl addiction. 2 weeks before she vanished, she had lost temporary custody of Nova to her own mother, Jennifer, a moment so full of heartbreak that, for Layla, every day afterward felt like exile. Her relationship with her boyfriend, Michael Thompson, had grown explosive and toxic, marked by cycles of bitter arguments and desperate reconciliations. Layla, by all accounts, was a generous friend but a restless partner, vulnerable, her boundaries worn thin by codependence and addiction. Those who saw her in the Amarcourt Hotel in the days before she disappeared recall someone barely holding on to reality, trying to hide in the shadows, slipping from room to room, invisible to most except those who later remembered her in fragments. The final days of June 2023 unfolded with increasing tension. Layla's family knew she was in trouble, but not how close to the edge she stood. Friday, June 23rd. Layla leaves the home she shares with Michael and his mother after a bitter confrontation. Whether this was with Michael or another member of the household, the details are muddy, but the result is the same. Layla, exhausted and angry, packs her few things and leaves. For a few nights, she stays with friends, sometimes secretly seeing another man, and keeps herself away from Michael. Her family later pieced together that she fled abruptly, without shoes or many belongings. By Saturday night, Michael begins sending anxious messages to Layla's family and friends, asking if anyone knows where she is, claiming to be worried for her safety. Messages from Layla's Facebook account reach Jennifer, her mother, asking if Layla is in jail or the hospital. Michael, not Layla, is the one writing. In that tangled mess of communication, the codependency is clear. They share a phone, sometimes share social media accounts, their digital lives as entwined as their real ones. Late Sunday morning, Layla herself finally messages Jennifer, frustrated by the worry and eager to assure her mother she's safe, if only for a moment. "I love you so much more," she writes, her last confirmed words. Monday arrives with Michael again messaging Jennifer, laying on guilt and fear. "You don't know the terrible things that could happen to her out here on the streets. She doesn't need to be out there on her own," he says, trying to manipulate Jennifer into finding Layla for him. Jennifer's panic peaks as Layla's whereabouts remain opaque. That day, Layla is involved in an altercation at a friend's house, then leaves with another individual, finally arriving at the Amarcourt Hotel in Kingsport. Hotel security footage confirms her presence that evening. In the early hours of June 27th, Layla's father, unable to sleep with the mounting anxiety, calls the police from New Jersey to report his daughter missing. There is no mandatory waiting period in Tennessee for missing adult cases. Police arrive at Michael's home, where he and his family cooperate. Meanwhile, Layla is seen at the hotel, acting frightened, hiding in the laundry room. When police show up in the parking lot, she is seen running into the woods behind the hotel, barefoot, terrified. Witnesses outside the Amarcourt Hotel recall Layla, her eyes wide as she moved through the field, speaking briefly with a warehouse worker for a cigarette, wishing him well before disappearing toward the Kingsport Greenbelt, the wooded trail system that threads through Kingsport like a vein holding secrets. Later that morning, someone reports seeing Layla inside an ice cream shop on Eastman Road, saying she planned to buy shoes and head to a nearby store. But police would later confirm that this was not Layla, but another young woman with similar physical characteristics. The trail grows cold and confusing. Surveillance footage shows a barefoot Layla heading away from the last known location, farther from the city's center, into the green shadows of Kingsport. Layla's family clings to hope as the hours draw on, but her absence is stark. She is missing her scheduled family court appearance on June 28th, a major red flag. Her mother's ex-boyfriend investigates a hotel room tied to Layla, but there's nothing there. Michael and two other men are seen lurking near the Amarcourt Hotel, sometimes knocking on doors, sometimes just standing silently. On June 30th, Layla's father's girlfriend in New Jersey receives a Cash App request from Layla's account, asking for money. Hoping to confirm Layla's identity, Jennifer sends small amounts of money, only to have the person on the other end claim to be Layla's kidnapper. Ransom threats begin. The messages are cryptic and terrifying. TWLMG. They won't let me go. For 15 minutes, or you'll find her in pieces. At first, law enforcement is slow to react, dismissing the requests as scams. When the demands escalate to $2,000, they launch a deeper investigation, tracing the transactions to Michael's address. In August 2023, authorities search Layla and Michael's shared residence, 562 Dale Street. Michael is questioned for hours. He's indicted for identity theft and extortion related to the Cash App scam, but police clarify repeatedly. There is no evidence linking him to Layla's actual disappearance. His role is sinister, opportunistic, but apparently peripheral to the core mystery. Over the weeks and months that follow, Layla's mother, Jennifer, grows ever more frantic but determined. She launches a social media campaign, organizes vigils, hires a private investigator, even consults psychics. Anything to shake something loose in the investigation. She becomes the relentless heart of the search, raising Nova Grace and other children, while somehow keeping the world moving even as a central pillar of her life is absent. As fall turns into winter, ground searches involving multiple agencies, Sullivan County Emergency Management, Kingsport Fire Department, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and more, are conducted throughout the Greenbelt and East Stone Commons area. Specialized equipment, including drones and K-9s, are used, but no evidence is found. The story repeats itself. March 2025, Layla remains missing. The Kingsport Police Department releases detailed updates, clarifies rumors, and emphasizes the continuing urgency of the investigation. Yet the facts remain. Layla was last seen at about 6:15 a.m. on June 27, 2023, in that field by the Amarcourt Hotel. All else is speculation, shadow, and grief. Her family refuses to give up. Still asking for answers, still offering hope. A $7,000 reward is posted for information. Volunteers resume ground searches when the weather turns. In the years since her disappearance, the threads of connection between Layla and Kingsport grow ever more entangled. Her mother remains convinced, sometimes beyond rationality, that her daughter might still be alive. Others fear the worst. Search efforts pause over the cold months and resume when ground conditions improve. Law enforcement maintains Layla as a priority, entering her information into FBI and national missing persons databases. The Holly Bobo Act provides expanded resources for Tennessee Bureau of Investigation involvement. They follow up every tip, every odd rumor, even the ones that seem improbable. And so Layla's story remains suspended. The facts are straightforward. Her life upended by addiction, family loss, a troubled relationship, a descent into deeper chaos. Her disappearance follows a classic tragic arc: crisis, flight, final sighting, and aftermath clouded by uncertainty. The emotional devastation to her family is profound. Jennifer's life narrows to two obsessions: raising Nova Grace and never letting Layla's memory fade from the world's consciousness. Kingsport's streets and wooded greenbelts now hold both the hope and the fear that surrounds Layla's name. Ground searches resume with every new season, and Jennifer continues the watch. Authorities maintain that there is no evidence Layla's case is related to other local disappearances, though speculation lingers. The missing often find their way into the same conversations, same prayer circles, same desperate posts on social media. Through every moment of hope and despair, Layla remains a vivid presence. Her tattoos, her voice, her brief, final words echoing in Jennifer's mind. I love you so much more. For the family and friends she left behind, those words carry not just loss but the possibility of closure. A last puzzle piece, a last memory, a last prayer that one day she'll come home. For the city of Kingsport, the mystery of Layla Santinello casts a long shadow on the still mornings and the restless nights. It is a story of heartbreak and endurance, where suspense is the daily reality, and every step along the greenbelt is a reminder of loss, love, and the unrelenting search for answers. Story 6. The wind across the central Kansas plains tells no stories, but it carries them, whispering through the sparse, hardy grasses and rattling the skeletal branches of winter-bare trees. It's a relentless, scouring wind that shapes the land and the people, carving patience into their faces and a certain kind of quiet into their souls. Here, the sky is an immense, overwhelming presence, a canvas of aching blue or bruised violet that dwarfs everything beneath it. In this land of immense horizons and small, huddled towns, secrets are a currency, hoarded and buried like winter provisions, sometimes for so long that they become part of the soil itself. In the autumn of 2015, in the diminutive town of Alden, a place with fewer than 150 residents, a speck of dust on the vast map of Rice County, that same wind began to pick at the edges of a secret, one that would soon become a howl of grief and unanswered questions. It was a secret that clung to a young woman named Megan Renee Fogelsong, a woman whose vibrant smile was a stark, beautiful contrast to the muted landscape she had come to call home. Megan was not of this place. Her roots were in Oneida, Illinois, a small farming community like so many others in the Midwest, but one that felt like a thriving metropolis compared to the profound stillness of Alden. She was a product of a loving, blended family, raised by her father and her stepmother, Dawn, who had entered her life when Megan was just 9 and had become the only mother she truly knew. Megan was a supernova of a girl, crackling with an energy that seemed too big for her small-town origins. She had a laugh that was loud and infectious, a cascade of pure joy that could momentarily silence the ever-present wind. In her youth, she had channeled that energy onto the softball field, a formidable pitcher with a whip-crack arm and an unshakable focus, her blonde hair a flash of gold under the stadium lights. To her friends and family, she was the embodiment of happy-go-lucky, a kind and beautiful soul who carried an inner light bright enough to warm those around her. But even the brightest lights cast shadows. Beneath her cheerful exterior, a quiet restlessness stirred within Megan. It was a deep, persistent ache, a longing to connect with the biological mother, who was largely a ghost in her life story, a missing chapter she felt compelled to read. This yearning was the magnet that pulled her from the familiar comforts of Illinois to the stark, alien plains of Kansas. It was a decision made from the heart, a leap of faith into the unknown that would, with agonizing slowness, set in motion a tragedy from which there would be no return. In Alden, Megan found her biological mother, Pam Lewis, and tumbled into a relationship that was less about maternal guidance and more about a shared, reckless pursuit of excitement. The lines between mother and daughter blurred into a strange and unsettling friendship, a whirlwind of late nights, cheap drinks, and bathroom selfies that chronicled their descent into a chaotic, transient lifestyle. It was in this disorienting new world, a world so different from the structured love she had known, that Megan's life collided with David L. Madden. He was a man 14 years her senior, a former Marine whose time in Iraq had left him with more than just memories. He was a dark star, and Megan, adrift and searching, found herself caught in his gravitational pull. Their relationship was a maelstrom, a destructive and all-consuming affair that cycled between dizzying highs of passion and terrifying lows of violence. David was a man who wore his darkness like a second skin. He had a history of violence, a simmering rage, and a profound, paranoid distrust of any form of authority. His world was one of guns, which he collected with an unsettling fervor and a deep-seated hatred for law enforcement, a sentiment he made no effort to conceal. Unbeknownst to many, Madden had also once dated Megan's own mother, Pam, adding a twisted, Oedipal layer to the already toxic dynamic. The first tremor, the first undeniable sign of the violence that underpinned their connection, shook their world in December of 2014, a full year before Megan would vanish. The emergency dispatch in neighboring Barton County received a frantic 911 call from one of David's friends, a man named Kelly Starnes. His voice was tight with panic as he relayed a horrifying scene. David had kidnapped Megan from his house, bound her in a straitjacket, and was threatening to kill her. "He's got issues with authority," Starnes warned the dispatcher, his words a desperate plea for intervention. When officers from the Rice County Sheriff's Office arrived at David's residence in Alden, they found a scene of deceptive calm. They spoke with Megan separately, following the protocol for a domestic abuse call. But Megan, whether out of fear, loyalty, or a complex mix of both, denied she was being held against her will. She claimed she was there voluntarily. With no victim willing to press charges, the officers had no choice but to consider the matter settled. They left, and the darkness that had briefly been exposed to the light was allowed to fester once more. That chilling 911 call, a stark warning of Madden's capacity for brutality, became just another piece of paper in a file, a ghost that would later rise to haunt the investigation. This terrifying incident may have been the catalyst for Megan's brief return to Illinois. She retreated to the safety of her father and Dawn's home, where long, difficult conversations took place. Dawn, her heart aching for the girl she had raised, tried to make her see the inevitable trajectory of such a relationship. She spoke of statistics, of the way domestic violence rarely improves, how it almost always escalates in a brutal, predictable spiral. For a time, it seemed the message had been received. But the pull of Alden, of Pam, and of David proved too strong. Call it young love, call it a mistake, call it the insidious grip of a toxic bond. But by June of 2015, Megan was back in Kansas, back in the eye of the storm. The Megans' known existence were a blur of instability and escalating drug use. She and David were regularly using drugs, a drug that amplified his paranoia and eroded what was left of her judgment. The relationship continued its volatile dance. Friends voiced their concerns, and in moments of clarity, Megan echoed them. She confided in at least 2 close friends, her words a chilling premonition that would later become a cornerstone of the investigation. If she ever went missing, David would be the one responsible. As Thanksgiving approached in 2015, a flicker of hope emerged. David was in jail for driving with a suspended license, and the brief separation seemed to give Megan the space to breathe, to think. On November 25th, the day before David was scheduled for release, she made a decision. She was done. She reached out to her stepmother, Dawn, and to a friend, her messages filled with a newfound resolve. She was leaving David for good. Later that day, she texted a friend, asking for a ride. She was walking in the rain, alone on a desolate Kansas road, trying to physically walk away from the life that was consuming her. But the friend couldn't pick her up. It was a small, unfortunate turn of events, a missed connection that, in retrospect, feels monumental. From that moment on, the timeline of Megan's life becomes murky, fragmented, and terrifyingly questionable. It is unknown what happened to Megan after that plea for a ride went unanswered. Did she find another way to the friend's house where she planned to spend the holiday? Or did she, defeated and soaked by the cold November rain, turn back? Some speculate that David, upon his release the next day, found her, and their relationship turned on again for one final, fatal time. Others fear that the subsequent messages from her accounts were not from her at all, but from someone who already held her fate in their hands. The last verified activity from Megan was a Facebook message to a friend on November 30th, 2015. In it, she stated simply that she was at David's house. The very next day, on December 1st, David Madden made a calculated, preemptive move. He contacted the Rice County Sheriff's Office, not to report Megan missing, but to report her for a crime. He claimed he had caught her stealing from him, that they had argued, and that she had stormed out into the unknown. It was a narrative designed to cast her as transient and unreliable, and him as the wronged party. A week later, on December 7th, a final, cryptic message was sent from Megan's phone to a friend. It consisted of 2 words, "I'm fine." But the friend who received it felt a chill. The terse, impersonal tone was wrong. It didn't sound like Megan. Around the same time, another friend reported receiving a call from her, asking for a ride, but when the friend went to the designated spot, Megan was gone. There was one more potential sighting, a ghost of a lead. A friend's mother believed she saw Megan at a liquor store in Larned, a town 50 miles away, on Christmas Day. But her memory was hazy. She later admitted it might have been closer to Thanksgiving. And then nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. The messages stopped. The phone went dead. The vibrant young woman with the infectious laugh and the dream-catcher tattoo on her calf had vanished, swallowed whole by the vast, indifferent landscape of the Kansas plains. Because of her chaotic lifestyle and the story David had planted, the alarm was not raised immediately. 2 months crawled by. Dawn, back in Illinois, grew increasingly frantic. Her daily calls and texts to Megan, once met with sporadic replies, now went into a digital void. It was a parent's worst nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Finally, on February 10th, 2016, unable to bear the silence any longer, Megan's family officially reported her missing. That 2-month delay proved to be a catastrophic blow to the investigation. The trail, which was already cold, had been frozen solid by the passage of time. Megan's prepaid phone, a potential treasure trove of data, was a dead end. The carrier only kept records for 10 days. The Rice County Sheriff's Office, now officially on the case, immediately zeroed in on David Madden. He was the last person known to have seen her, the nexus of her troubled life in Kansas. When questioned, he was a picture of cool detachment, claiming to have no idea where she might have gone. But his friend, Kelly Starnes, the same man who had made the panicked 911 call a year earlier, told investigators a different, more sinister story. He said that David had told him, with a chilling finality, that no one will ever have to worry about her again. With that statement, the investigation shifted. This was no longer just a missing person case. The authorities now suspected foul play. In the years following Megan's disappearance, David Madden's life became a case study in violent implosion. His paranoia and rage, no longer contained by the semblance of a relationship, began to spill over into the community. In February 2017, he became the subject of a high-speed chase that tore through 2 counties, ending in a tense police standoff. A subsequent search of his property was a descent into a madman's arsenal. Investigators uncovered 2 crates filled with live military ordnance, a small mountain of smokeless powder, an AK-47 machine gun he claimed to have smuggled back from Iraq, and numerous other firearms. He casually told police he'd been making and setting off pipe bombs for fun since he was a child. For all this, he was charged with aggravated assault and inexplicably sentenced to probation. During this time, Dawn refused to let Megan's memory fade. She became a relentless advocate, a warrior mother battling a system she felt was failing her daughter, sharing updates, pleading for information, and keeping Megan's face in the public eye. In a remarkable and heart-wrenching act of desperation, Dawn herself gained permission from David's father, Thomas, to excavate a suspicious patch of ground on David's property in 2016. long before law enforcement would. With shovel in hand, she dug into the cold Kansas earth, searching for her daughter's remains, a search that yielded nothing but more heartache. The final, bloody chapter of David Madden's life unfolded on April 29, 2019. It was a day of reckoning that began with a routine traffic stop in Sterling, Kansas. Madden was pulled over for an outstanding warrant related to his illegal possession of the machine gun. But for David, there was nothing routine about an encounter with law enforcement. Before the officer could react, he opened fire, shooting Rice County Undersheriff Chad Murphy 5 times. With a woman and a child in the vehicle with him, Madden fled the scene, driving not to a hideout, but to his father's home in the nearby town of Raymond. There, his rampage continued. He murdered his 65-year-old father, Thomas Madden, the man who had shown a glimmer of kindness to Dawn in her desperate search. When Rice County Sheriff Bryant Evans arrived at the chaotic scene, Madden met him with another volley of gunfire, wounding him in the leg. What followed was a 6-hour standoff, a siege that drew a massive law enforcement presence from across the state. The house was surrounded, the night air thick with tension and the smell of gunpowder. Finally, as dawn approached, the tactical team stormed the residence. Inside, they found 2 bodies. Thomas Madden lay dead from his son's hand, and David Madden was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. For Megan's family, the news of David's death was a complex and bitter pill. There was a surge of relief that this violent, destructive man could no longer harm anyone. But that relief was quickly swallowed by a wave of devastating finality. The one person who almost certainly knew what happened to Megan, the man who held the key to their endless nightmare, had taken that secret to his grave. In the aftermath, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation officially named David Madden as the prime and only suspect in Megan's disappearance and presumed murder. Armed with search warrants, they returned to his property in October 2019. They brought excavation equipment and cadaver dogs, focusing on the same grave site Dawn had dug herself years before. A grim theory had emerged that David had killed Megan, fed her remains to his dog, and then killed and buried the dog to hide the evidence. But the search, like Dawn's before it, turned up nothing. The earth offered up no clues, no bones, no closure. Today, the wind still scours the plains of Rice County. The case of Megan Fogelsong remains open, a wound that will not close. Her family continues to wait, suspended in the unbearable limbo of not knowing. Dawn still posts on Megan's memorial page, her love a constant, burning light in the face of impenetrable darkness. Megan's story is a tragic monument to the insidious power of domestic violence and the gut-wrenching reality of a search for answers that may never come. Her name is not a story the wind tells, but one it carries, a beautiful, heartbreaking whisper of a life stolen too soon, a question mark branded forever onto the vast, silent landscape of Kansas. Story 7. The farmhouse stood silent on the morning of November 1st, 1975, its stillness unnatural for a working farm at the height of harvest season. 600 acres of corn waited in the fields, unpicked and golden under the pale autumn sky. The corn dryer, which should have been humming with activity, sat motionless. The power to the entire property had been shut off. Something was terribly wrong at the Mark family farm outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, and when a concerned neighbor finally ventured inside the sprawling 17-room house that had sheltered generations of the Mark family, he discovered a scene of such profound horror that it would haunt the heartland for decades to come. Inside, 4 members of the Mark family lay dead, each one shot with methodical precision in what appeared to be a calculated execution. Leslie Mark, 25 years old and the farmer who had recently taken over the family operation, had been shot 5 times, 4 bullets to the head and 1 to the stomach. His wife, Georgian, also 25, had been shot 4 times, twice in the head and once in the back. But the true horror of the scene revealed itself upstairs, where the couple's 2 young children had been murdered in their beds. 5-year-old Julie Mark had been shot twice, once through the heart and once through her right eye. In another bedroom, 18-month-old Jeffrey lay dead, shot once in the left chest and once above the right eye. The brutality was incomprehensible, the violence cold and deliberate, carried out while the victims slept peacefully on Halloween night. The Mark family had been pillars of their community for generations, with the farm itself a testament to hard work and perseverance. Leslie, known as Les, had grown up on this land, learning the rhythms of agricultural life from his parents, Wayne and Dorothy Mark. He had attended the University of Northern Iowa, where he met Georgian, and the couple had built what seemed like an idyllic life together with their two beautiful children. Just 3 weeks before the murders, Les and Georgian had moved their young family into the ancestral farmhouse, taking over operations from Wayne and Dorothy, who relocated to a smaller home nearby. The investigation began immediately, with local law enforcement joined by agents from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The crime scene told a chilling story of premeditation and intimate knowledge of the property. The killer had approached the farmhouse on foot in the early morning hours, walking up the dirt and gravel driveway. Investigators discovered that the telephone wires in a terminal box across the road had been cut, ensuring that no one inside could call for help. During the process of cutting those wires, the killer had dropped 2 .38 caliber long Colt bullets on the ground, a clue that would later prove significant. The intruder had moved with purpose and familiarity. Shoe prints made by size 11 men's Converse tennis shoes revealed the killer's path. He had walked past the main house to a camper where Leslie occasionally slept, perhaps checking to see if his primary target was there. Finding it empty, he had returned to the house and used a key that normally hung by the back door to enter. Before committing the murders, he descended into the basement, turned off the power, and smoked 2 Marlboro cigarettes, perhaps steeling himself for what was to come. Then he moved through the darkened house, methodically shooting each family member before fleeing. After leaving the farm, the killer had smoked another Marlboro cigarette in Julie's bedroom, a detail so coldly calculated that it defied comprehension. As investigators worked to piece together who could have committed such an unthinkable crime, they faced a perplexing question. Who would want this beloved family dead? The Marks had no known enemies. They were hard-working, respected members of the community. The brutality of the murders suggested rage, but rage directed at what? And why murder innocent children in their beds? The answer, when it came, shocked the community even more than the murders themselves. Investigators began to focus their attention on Jerry Allen Mark, Leslie's older brother, who lived more than 1,500 miles away in Berkeley, California. Jerry, 31 years old at the time, seemed an unlikely suspect. He was an attorney, a former Peace Corps volunteer, and by all accounts a highly intelligent, accomplished man. Yet as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a web of circumstantial evidence that pointed inexorably toward Jerry Mark as the perpetrator of these heinous crimes. The motive, prosecutors would later argue, was as the jealousy of Cain toward his brother Abel. The case would become known in Iowa as the Cain and Abel murders, a reference that prosecutor David Dutton invoked at trial to explain what could drive a man to murder his own brother and his brother's family. According to the prosecution's theory, Jerry Mark harbored deep resentment over the fact that his younger brother had inherited the family farm. When Wayne Mark's health began to fail, he and Dorothy had chosen Leslie to take over the farm operation rather than Jerry. Jerry, living in California and pursuing his legal career, had allegedly told a friend that his little brother had screwed him out of his farm. This perceived slight, this ancient wound of favoritism and inheritance, had allegedly festered until it exploded into murderous violence on Halloween night. The circumstantial evidence that investigators assembled was extensive. In early October 1975, Jerry Mark purchased a white helmet and a used 450 cubic centimeter Honda motorcycle near his residence in Berkeley. Though Jerry already owned a smaller motorcycle registered in Iowa, he removed the Iowa license plate from it and attached it to the larger one he had just purchased. On October 20th, using his Iowa driver's license for identification, Jerry purchased a box of 50 .38 caliber Winchester Western Long Colt bullets, a rare type of ammunition, from Ken's Sport Shop in Paso Robles, California. A gun store clerk would later identify Jerry as the customer who bought those bullets, the same type used in the murders. On October 28th, just 3 days before Halloween, Jerry bought a black Belstaff riding suit and motorcycle gloves from a Honda dealership in Berkeley. On the morning of October 29th, Jerry Mark left his Berkeley apartment on his motorcycle, ostensibly beginning a cross-country road trip. What happened over the next several days would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jerry traveled east on Interstate 80, and by the morning of October 31st, Halloween, he had reached Chapel, Nebraska, where a maintenance worker encountered him at a rest area and remembered his unusual politeness. From there, the prosecution contended, Jerry continued east toward Iowa, stopping at various locations where witnesses would later recall seeing him. At a Stuckey's pecan shop in Brady, Nebraska, a former state trooper named Donald Shearer had a full facial view of a man on a motorcycle matching Jerry's description, remembering him because he appeared too clean-cut for a biker. The trail of sightings continued. A waitress named Carolyn Kemp served a polite motorcyclist at the Shamrock Cafe in Atlantic, Iowa, on the evening of October 31st, finding him notably courteous and cute. She and a coworker would later identify Jerry Mark as that customer. From Atlantic, the motorcyclist proceeded to Newton, Iowa, and then north to Ackley, stopping at a Holiday gas station at approximately 8 o'clock on Halloween evening. Ackley was only 36 miles from the Leslie Mark farm. The prosecution argued that Jerry Mark rode his motorcycle the remaining distance to his brother's farm, arriving sometime between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. He parked his motorcycle out of sight, then approached the farmhouse on foot, leaving those distinctive shoe prints. He cut the telephone wires, dropped the 2 bullets, checked the camper for his brother, and then used the key by the back door to enter the house. He went to the basement, turned off the power, smoked his Marlboro cigarettes, and then, moving through the house he had known since childhood, systematically murdered his brother, his sister-in-law, and his niece and nephew. After the killings, Jerry Mark was spotted at a gas station in Williams, Iowa, 66 miles west of the Mark farmhouse, at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning on November 1st. By the evening of November 2nd, he had arrived at the home of friends in South Lake Tahoe, California, completing an extraordinarily rapid cross-country journey. When questioned by police after the murders were discovered, Jerry initially lied about his route, a fact that severely damaged his credibility. He later claimed he had lied to keep his girlfriend from discovering a sexual encounter he had with a hitchhiker. On November 10th, just 10 days after the murders, Jerry Allen Mark was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The trial was moved to Woodbury County to ensure an impartial jury. Beginning in the spring of 1976, the prosecution built its case entirely on circumstantial evidence, as no eyewitnesses had seen Jerry at the farm, and his fingerprints were never found at the scene. The state relied on the trail of witness identifications, the purchase of the rare ammunition, the shoe print evidence, and the timing of his motorcycle trip. The shoe print evidence proved particularly controversial. 2 podiatrists testified that Jerry exhibited distinctive walking characteristics that matched the prints found at the murder scene. However, the defense challenged the reliability of the witness identifications, arguing that showing a single photograph of Jerry to hundreds of potential witnesses was inherently suggestive. The defense also pointed to the lack of physical evidence directly tying Jerry to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no gunshot residue. The case was built entirely on circumstances, on witnesses who may have been influenced, and on scientific analyses that would later be called into question. On June 22, 1976, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Jerry Mark was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison. From his prison cell, however, he refused to accept his fate quietly, proclaiming his innocence and beginning a decades-long battle through the appellate courts. His initial direct appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court in 1979 was unsuccessful, with the court affirming his conviction. For years, it seemed Jerry's protests would come to nothing. Then, in 2006, 30 years after his conviction, a federal judge threw out the conviction, ruling that prosecutors had suppressed documents tending to show Jerry's innocence. For Jerry, now in his 60s, it seemed that vindication might finally be at hand. But the victory was short-lived. The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the ruling and reversed it, reinstating the conviction. As time passed and scientific techniques advanced, questions about the evidence used to convict Jerry Mark began to multiply. The saliva analysis on the cigarette butts found at the murder scene was retested using modern DNA technology, and the new results showed that the saliva did not match Jerry Mark. This was significant, as the cigarette butts had been key pieces of evidence placing him at the crime scene. Furthermore, the neutron activation analysis of the bullets, used to link the ammunition found at the scene to the bullets Jerry purchased, was now considered unreliable by the FBI. The case took on new life in late October 2024, when the State Public Defender's Office Wrongful Conviction Unit filed an application for post-conviction relief on behalf of Jerry Mark. The filing, more than 100 pages long, detailed new evidence, including a startling new theory. The murders may have been a mafia hit meant for someone else, possibly connected to a family friend who had testified against a drug cartel. Brian Vakulskas, a Sioux City attorney convinced of Jerry's innocence, stated, "This certainly looked like a mafia hit. The 4 brutal slayings were by shotgun to the head and heart of all the victims. But the investigation focused on Jerry from nearly the beginning." He argued that the case represented classic tunnel vision by prosecutors. The new application detailed multiple grounds for overturning the conviction, including claims that the state presented false testimony, relied on junk science, and violated Jerry's due process rights. The Mark family murders remain one of the most controversial criminal cases in Iowa history. For those who believe in Jerry Mark's guilt, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. The motorcycle trip, the purchase of the rare ammunition, the trail of witnesses, the shoe prints, and the powerful motive of jealousy. The prosecution's Cain and Abel narrative provides a horrifyingly comprehensible explanation for the crimes. For those who believe in his innocence, the case represents a miscarriage of justice built on flawed science and tunnel vision. They point to the lack of physical evidence, the DNA results that exclude Jerry, the unreliability of the bullet analysis, and the possibility of an alternative perpetrator. They argue that Jerry was convicted not because the evidence was solid, but because he was a convenient suspect. The truth of what happened on that Halloween night remains elusive. What is not in dispute is the horror of the crimes themselves. For innocent people were murdered in their beds, and a family was destroyed. Wayne and Dorothy Mark lost not only a son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, but also their other son, either to the evil he committed or to a justice system that wrongly convicted him. Nearly 50 years after that terrible night, Jerry Mark remains in prison, now over 80 years old. He has spent more of his life behind bars than he spent as a free man, and his appeals continue, driven by new advocates who believe that justice has not been served. The Mark family murders stand as a testament to how a single night of violence can reverberate through decades, destroying lives and raising questions that may never be fully answered. It is a stark reminder that sometimes the truth is far more elusive than we would like to believe. Story 8. The water at Cedar Creek Marina had a particular way of catching the last light of day, turning the placid surface of Old Hickory Lake into a canvas of liquid gold and deep, encroaching purples. It was a sight that drew people from all over Middle Tennessee, a promise of peace and a temporary escape from the relentless hum of nearby Nashville, just a 25-minute drive away. The marina, a cornerstone of the Mount Juliet boating community for decades, was a place of deep-seated memories and modern amenities, a sanctuary for those who found solace in the gentle rock of a boat and the vast expanse of open water. Old Hickory Lake itself was a product of a post-war dream, a man-made reservoir created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the 1950s. Named after the notoriously tough 7th U.S. President Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee native nicknamed Old Hickory. The lake was a testament to the region's history and its ambition. The dream of a club for fishing and boating on the new lake had taken root in the minds of a dozen men from the Davidson County Sportsman Club. They had scouted the land, pooled their resources, and taken a considerable gamble, with one man, W.E. Jones, even pledging his bank stock to borrow the $10,000 needed to buy the land. It was a gamble that had paid off handsomely. Over the years, what started as a simple fishing club had evolved into the prestigious Cedar Creek Yacht Club, a sprawling facility with a saltwater pool, tennis courts, and cottage lake homes. The marina, adjacent to the yacht club, offered a more accessible slice of this lakeside paradise. It was a full-service destination with secure wet slips for boats up to 80 feet, a fuel dock dispensing non-ethanol marine-grade fuel, and a well-stocked ship's store for all the essentials of a day on the water. The open-air restaurant, with its full bar and delicious food, was a popular hangout, a place where locals and visitors alike could gather to watch the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. There was even a church by the lake, which had started in 1958 on a homemade houseboat and had since grown into a permanent fixture with stone platforms and weatherproof pews, a testament to the community's enduring faith and its connection to the water. For Bailey Troy Gardner, a young man of 27 with a future as bright and open as the Kansas plains he hailed from, this marina was supposed to be the start of a weekend adventure. He had arrived on the evening of June 28, 2024, his truck pulling a boat, a vessel meant to carry him across the shimmering waters of Percy Priest Lake, a short drive from Old Hickory. He was a man who understood the mechanics of a well-laid plan, a technical program manager at Amazon, someone whose life revolved around precision, order, and the successful execution of complex projects. But there are some variables that no plan can account for, dark and unpredictable currents that can pull a life under in the blink of an eye. Bailey was a man in motion, a life lived with a quiet but firm sense of purpose. Born in Lenexa, Kansas on July 9, 1997, he had grown up with the heartland's rhythm in his blood. He was a product of Spring Hill High School and later Pittsburgh State University, where he had cultivated his sharp mind and his love for baseball, a sport he had lettered in 4 times in high school. He had even played in the 13U World Series with his travel team, a testament to his dedication and skill. His coach at Pittsburgh State remembered him as a hard worker, a young man who was always willing to put in the extra effort to improve his game. But as with many young men, the diamond eventually gave way to a different kind of field, the burgeoning world of technology. His career at Amazon was a source of pride, a symbol of his hard work and his ability to navigate the intricate pathways of a global corporation. He had started as an intern and had quickly risen through the ranks, his intelligence and work ethic earning him the respect of his colleagues. He was the kind of person who could take a complex problem and break it down into manageable parts, a skill that made him invaluable to his team. Yet he had never lost his love for the outdoors, for the simple pleasure of being on the water, the sun on his face, the world and its demands a distant shore. His social media was a tapestry of a life fully lived, a collection of images that told the story of a young man who was just as comfortable in a corporate boardroom as he was on a boat in the middle of a lake. There were pictures of him with his friends, a wide grin on his face, his arms slung around their shoulders in a gesture of easy camaraderie. There were pictures of him with his family, the love and pride in their eyes a reflection of the man he had become. And there were pictures of him on the water, his boat cutting through the waves, a look of pure joy on his face. That Friday, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the Cedar Creek Marina, Bailey was likely filled with the easy anticipation of a weekend well-earned. He had driven for hours to get there, the miles scrolling by as he listened to music and thought about the days ahead. He was a man who was loved, a son, a friend, a colleague, someone whose presence was a steady and reassuring constant in the lives of those who knew him. He was, by all accounts, just a good man, in the wrong place at the very worst time. While Bailey was settling into the quiet solitude of his truck, the last vestiges of daylight fading from the sky. A different kind of plan was unfolding just a few yards away, inside the marina's restaurant. The staff was closing up for the night, the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation giving way to the familiar rituals of shutting down. The open-air restaurant, which on a summer evening would have been filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses, was now quiet, the last of the diners having departed, leaving only the staff to finish their work. It was in this vulnerable moment, as the last of the day's warmth bled from the air, that three armed men burst in, their faces obscured, their intentions brutally clear. The scene inside the restaurant descended into a nightmare of violence and fear. Two of the restaurant's employees were assaulted, their evening's work ending not with a quiet commute home, but with the cold, hard reality of a gun and the terrifying demands of desperate men. The robbers forced the bruised and shaken employees to open the restaurant's safe, their greed a palpable and menacing presence in the now silent room. They were a whirlwind of controlled chaos, their movements practiced, their threats chillingly real. They took what they came for and then vanished back into the night, leaving behind a scene of disarray and a lingering sense of violation. But their night of terror was not yet over. As they fled the scene of the robbery, their pockets filled with stolen cash, they cut through the marina's parking lot, a space that was now cast in the deep shadows of the Tennessee night. And it was there, in the quiet darkness, that they came across a lone truck, a single occupant sitting inside, a man who had no connection to their crime, no knowledge of the violence that had just transpired. Bailey Gardner, waiting patiently for the dawn and the promise of a day on the lake, suddenly found his solitude shattered. One of the robbers, a man, approached Bailey's truck. What happened in those next few moments is known only to the perpetrator and his victim, a final, horrifying chapter in Bailey's life written in a language of violence and senselessness. McLean, for reasons that may never be fully understood, raised his gun and fired, the sound of the shot a brutal punctuation mark in the quiet of the marina. Bailey, shot while sitting in the driver's seat of his own truck, a place of safety and familiarity, was gone in an instant, his dreams of a weekend on the water replaced by the cold, unforgiving finality of death. He was, as the Wilson County Sheriff's Office would later state, an innocent bystander, a life extinguished not for what he had done, but simply for where he was. The first responders, Mt. Juliet police officers, arrived to a scene of confusion and tragedy. They had been dispatched to a robbery, but what they found was something far worse. They discovered Bailey in his vehicle, his life slipping away. They did what they could, their training kicking in, their efforts a desperate race against a clock that had already run out. But Bailey's injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead at the scene, his life's journey ending in a place he had come to for recreation and peace. The murder of Bailey Gardner sent a shockwave through the community and beyond. The news of his senseless death reached his family in Kansas, a blow that was as sudden as it was devastating. On a GoFundMe page set up to help the family with the unforeseen costs of this tragedy, the heartbreak was palpable. "We are all heartbroken, and no words can describe how much he will be missed by so many." The page read, a simple and profound expression of a grief that was immeasurable. The page was also a testament to the love that surrounded Bailey, a collection of memories and messages from friends and family who remembered him for all the good times and the love he had for them. While a family mourned, a joint investigation was launched by the Wilson County Sheriff's Office and the Mt. Juliet Police Department. The case was a complex one, with a robbery and a murder to unravel, and 3 suspects who had vanished into the night. The investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence, interviewing the traumatized restaurant staff, and trying to make sense of a crime that was as brutal as it was random. The fact that the restaurant was within the city limits of Mt. Juliet, while the parking lot where Bailey was killed fell under the jurisdiction of Wilson County, added another layer of complexity to the investigation. For weeks, the investigation continued, a quiet and determined effort to bring justice to a young man whose life had been stolen. Then on July 17, 2024, there was a breakthrough. Acting on information they had gathered, law enforcement officers located and arrested Adrian McLean in Nashville. He was taken into custody and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated robbery, the first of the 3 suspects to be brought to justice. The trial of Adrian McLean began in September 2025, a little over a year after the murder of Bailey Gardner. The prosecution, led by District Attorney General Jason Lawson, laid out the case against McLean, painting a picture of a violent and ruthless man who had not only robbed and terrorized the staff of the Cedar Creek Marina restaurant, but had also callously taken the life of an innocent man. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and on September 18, 2025, a Wilson County jury found Adrian McLean guilty of first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated robbery. The conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory life sentence, ensuring that McLean would never again be able to inflict such pain and suffering on another human being. The verdict was a measure of justice for Bailey Gardner, a legal and moral accounting for a life that had been so cruelly and needlessly taken. But for Bailey's family and friends, the pain of his loss would endure, a void that no court verdict could ever fill. The story of Bailey Gardner is not just a story of a crime, but a story of a life. It is a reminder of the fragility of our existence, of the way in which the best-laid plans can be undone in a moment of random violence. It is also a story of a community's response to tragedy, of the way in which people can come together to support one another in the face of unimaginable grief. And it is a story of the tireless pursuit of justice, of the men and women in law enforcement who work to bring a measure of peace to those who have been wronged. 2 of the men who were with Adrian McLean that night remain at large, their faces and names unknown, their crimes unpunished. A reward of $15,000 has been offered for information leading to their capture and conviction, a reminder that the quest for justice for Bailey Gardner is not yet complete. The last sunset at Cedar Creek for Bailey Gardner was not the one he had planned, not the peaceful end to a day that would lead to a weekend of adventure and fun. Instead, it was a sunset that marked the end of a life of promise, a life of purpose, a life that was loved. And it is for that life that the search for complete justice continues.